Hello, fellow classmates and professor. I am Patrick Abraham, and I'm here with Sofia Humo and Roberto Chevalier to show you what we learned from the Nike Sweatshop scandal. For those who don't know, a sweatshop is a place of work where the employees are treated with disrespect and working long hours for little pay.
Practices to the point where it badly tarnished the company's image and hurt sales. Nike was an early target for the very reason it's been so successful. Its business model was based on outsourcing its manufacturing, using the money it saved on aggressive marketing campaigns. Nike has managed to turn its image around. It hasn't been completely successful in bringing factories into line. But there's no denying that the company has executed one of the greatest image turnaround in recent decades. Here's a timeline of how Nike became a global symbol of abusive labor practices, then managed to turn things around. Problems start in 1991 when activist Jeff Ballinger publishes a report documenting low wages and poor working conditions in Indonesia. Nike first formally responds to complaints with a factory code of conduct. In 1992, Ballinger publishes an expose of Nike. His Harper's article highlights an Indonesian worker who worked for a Nike subcontractor for 14 cents an hour, less than Indonesia's minimum wage, and documented other abuses. To continue, in 1992 to 1993, protests at the Barcelona Olympics CBS 1993 interview of Nike factory workers, and Ballinger's NDO Press for Change provokes a wave of mainstream media attention. Later, in 1996, Kathy Lee Gifford's clothing line is shown to be made by children in poor labor conditions. Her theory, apology, and activism makes it a national issue. Then, Nike establishes a department tasked with working to improve the lives of factory laborers. Later, on 1997, efforts of promotion become occasions for public outrage. The company expanded Niketown retail stores, only to see increasing protests. Sports media begin challenging spokespeople like Michael Jordan. Abuses continue to emerge, like a report that alleging that a Vietnamese subcontractor ran women outside until they collapsed for failing to wear regulation shoes. Nike tasked diplomat and activist Andrew Young with examining its labor practices abroad. His report is criticized for being soft on Nike. Critics object to the fact that he didn't address low wages, used Nike interpreters to translate, and was accompanied by Nike officials on factory visits. Since Young's report was largely favorable, Nike is quick to publicize it, which increases backlash. Also, in that year, college students around the country began protesting the company. Then in 1998, Nike faces weak demand and unrelenting criticism. It has to lay off workers and begins to realize it needs to change. The real shift begins with a May 1998 speech by then CEO Phil Knight. The Nike product has become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse, Knight said. I truly believe the American consumer doesn't want to buy products made under abusive conditions. At that speech, he announces Nike will raise the minimum age of workers, significantly increase monitoring, and will adopt US OSHA clean air standards in all factories. It's 1999 and Nike begins creating the Fair Labor Association, a non-profit group that combines companies and human rights and labor representatives to establish independent monitoring and a code of conduct, including a minimum age and a 60-hour work week, and pushes other brands to join. From 2002 to 2004, the company performs some 600 factory audits between 2002 and 2004, including repeat visits to problematic factories. Also, in 2004, human rights activists acknowledged that increased monitoring efforts at least deal with some of the worst problems, like locked factory doors and unsafe chemicals, but issues still remains. In 2005, Nike becomes the first in its industry to publish a complete list of the factories it contracts with. Nike publishes a detailed 108-page report revealing conditions and pay in its factories and acknowledging widespread issues, particularly in its South Asian factories. From 2005 to the present day, the company continues to post its commitments, standards, and audit data as part of its corporate social responsibility reports.
What was the sweatshop scandal? It was a major public relations scandal that occurred in the 1990s. Nike had set up sweatshops in Indonesia, India, Thailand, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Cambodia. The whistle was blown about this whole operation in 1991 by Jeffrey Bollinger. It created a negative image to the world's biggest shoe company. Nike then became a synonym of the word exploitation. James W. Keedy was born and raised in New Jersey in 1971. He went on and studied at St. John's University, where he got a master's degree in pastoral theology and coached the men's soccer team. During his time at St. John's, he was doing a study on Nike sweatshops around the world, and at the same time, the university signed a $3.5 million deal to have Nike sponsor all sports equipment, meaning all coaches had to endorse Nike. He was not able to stand by and endorse a company that used people in need for their own gain. He stepped down as head coach and began to do a deep dive on Nike's sweatshop scandal. Without any clear findings, he decided to travel abroad with a fellow colleague named Leslie Kretsu to Indonesia and live the life of a Nike factory worker. After several days of being there, both Leslie and Jim were extremely sleep deprived from the horrible sleeping conditions and long work hours, and had little to no money to be able to buy drinkable water and a fulfilling meal. During their month in Indonesia, they recorded all their findings and created a documentary. The documentary later went viral, getting over 2 million views on YouTube, and more importantly, dismantled Nike's code of conduct in the work environment. Both Jim and Leslie went on to found a firm in awareness of human justice called Education for Justice. As mentioned before, Jim Keedy and Leslie Kretsu created a documentary called Nike Sweatshops Behind the Swoosh. During their travel to Indonesia, they lived off the Nike factory employee wages, which was $1.50 per day. This allowed them to have a small 9x9 concrete room with no ventilation, no lighting, and a toilet to share with two other families. Not only did they get very little food and water, but Nike also dumped all leftover shoe parts on the street of Indonesia and set them on fire, which led to toxic fumes spreading to the citizens of Indonesia. Along with horrible discoveries about the Nike sweatshops, Jim also interviewed several Nike factory employees that had shocking stories. Dita Sari was one of the people interviewed by Jim and Leslie. She's an activist in Indonesia that had been mugged, beaten, thrown out of her own house, and wrongly incarcerated. She was working for the rights of Nike and Reebok factory workers. In her own words, she was used as an example to stop other protesters from standing up for their rights and put in jail and tortured for days on end. Julianto was a man working for the Nike factory and trying to form an independent union. While trying to do so, he was threatened at gunpoint. His house got ransacked and he had no other choice but to flee to his home village. According to Jim Keedy, all this happened to both Dita and Julianto was from the mob. Apparently, the mob had ties with the sweatshop managers and had full control of the Nike factories in Indonesia. Though we only have two on the screen, all the other factory workers interviewed had a sense of fear. Though these factory workers don't want to lose their jobs by standing up for their rights, they have no other choice but to work these horrible jobs and get low money. Here's the documentary of Jim Keedy. The following are a list of laws in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Nike broke. First, in Article 5, which states, "No one shall be subject to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment of punishment." Then later in Article 9, which says, "No one shall be subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile." Nike also went against Article 12. "No one shall be subject to arbitrary interference with the privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks." Also, Nike broke Article 23, Section 1, which reads, "Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment." They also broke Article 24, which read, "Everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitations of working hours and periodic holidays with pay." The last one they broke was Article 25, Section 2, which said motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. All children, whether born in or out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection.
So right now we get to the part of the presentation where we can ask ourselves what impact did the sweatshop scandal have on Nike? This sweatshop scandal's impact on the company can be seen from three different points of view. First, we have the sales. You can see an increase in sales from 1991 to 1996, but that's just because even though Jeff Ballinger had told them off already, people weren't realizing that much, so they were still increasing in revenue. But then revenue started to fall in 1997 through 2006, which was the year when Nike actually started proving that they had improved work conditions. And this revenue decrease surpassed $5 million. So it was a huge decrease. Then, in the image, we can see protests going all around the country, big cities like New York, Los Angeles, and specifically in Oregon because that's where Nike's headquarters are located in. And lastly, the reputation. Nike suffered years of scrutiny, not just from media groups or from human rights groups, but they also suffered a lot from colleges because colleges had student groups and student unions that were pleading to their deans to please stop using Nike outfits for their sports teams because they felt like the brand had such a bad impact on the university's image that they really wanted to stop using Nike all at once. So after all the protests and all the brand image lost and all the reputation lost and all the revenue lost, it was now the now or never stage for Nike. And here we have a perfect quote by Jeff Ballinger to express that. He says, I think on the health and safety question, it is a very important statement. There's not a lot of wiggle room. They either fix it or they don't. I really, really believe they're going to get after the problem. And this is a quote he said in 1998 when Nike started getting deep into a lot of revenue loss and brand image loss and reputation loss. And he basically expressed that they won, the activist group won, by all of the publicly marketing they were doing to get Nike under the weather, to get Nike to pay, to get Nike to improve working conditions. They had finally done it, and Jeff Ballinger expresses that victory in this quote. So now we can ask ourselves, how did Nike step out of this problem? First, they started by Phil Knight, which was the CEO back then, give a speech where he talked about the set of guidelines Nike would create in 1998, which they would follow from that year further on. Some of these guidelines were that they increased the age of workers at Asian factories. In the shoe factories from 18 years or older, because in these factories, a lot of fatalities were experienced because of the dangerous work that workers did. And in the shirts and other Nike accessories, it was from 60 years and older. Then they solved an environmental issue, which was bringing a lot of havoc to the Nike scandal because they were burning the shoes and the clothes that they weren't going to sell because they overproduced them outside these factories, and these burnt shoes were provoking fumes that started giving little kids in the area cancer, and a lot of them died because of this issue. And so they promised they were going to be more environmental friendly and no more burning shoes or shirts. And lastly, they made it clear that they were going to pay at least the minimum wage to their workers, which in Indonesia was 125. But then, back then, when Jim Kitty made Behind the Swoosh, he said this was what they were all getting paid, but with further information gathered by different activist groups in the future till now, they actually found the fact that some of the workers were only getting paid 14 cents per day to work on those horrible conditions. After the guidelines were set in place, we can now see a quote by Phil Knight, which was Nike's CEO back then, which said, these moves would do more than just set industry standards, they reflect who we are as a company. It's very interesting to see this right now because you can notice some of that hypocrisy going on around the company because in the documentary Behind the Swoosh, they actually interviewed Phil Knight and asked them about all the workers in Indonesia being horribly mistreated, and he just said, I'm having lunch with a friend, please leave me alone. A lot of times until they finally left him alone because he knew what was going on, but he was really not planning to do anything about it at that time. This last slide is now to reflect on the fact that even though Nike implemented these measures, some activist groups were still not happy about the issue. Here we have a quote by Medea Benjamin, who was the director of the San Francisco-based human rights group Global Exchange. And she says, A sweatshop is a sweatshop unless you start paying a living wage, and that would be at least $3 a day. And we all know by Phil Knight's behavior when he was asked during Jim Kitty's documentary that he never planned to implement such a high wage for these workers, and that points to the fact that Nike has better than worker conditions, but still they are not fixing the problem.